In this video, I'm going to talk about what kinds of problems high histamine levels can cause in the body and how to detoxify it. I began my research trying to figure out how to help a mold-sensitive friend. What I found out was that she was making too much histamine. Digging deeper, I found out that a lot of chronic conditions many people suffer with are caused by high histamine. I knew that histamine can cause allergic reactions in the skin and sinuses. What I didn't know was that histamine can cause problems in virtually any tissue in the body. Histamine is both a hormone and a neurotransmitter, and it has receptors all throughout the body. There are 4 different histamine receptors: H1, H2, H3, and H4. H1 and H2 go to the skin, the gut, the lungs, and give us our classic allergy symptoms, like itchy and painful skin, food allergies, asthma, or sinus inflammation. What's less well known is these receptors are also found in the muscles, the joints, the heart, the nerves, the prostate, the uterus, the bladder. The list goes on. So how might this manifest? In the case of muscles, it could be fibromyalgia. In the case of the joints, arthritis or joint pain. In the case of the heart, high or low blood pressure, dizziness, arrhythmias, and postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, also known as POTS. In the nerves, chronic pain or neuropathy. In the prostate, prostate enlargement. In the case of the uterus, PMS, miscarriages, and difficulty conceiving a child. In the case of the bladder, interstitial cystitis, and pain or burning on urination. That's just the H1 and H2 receptors. There's 2 more. There's H3 and H4. H3 goes to the central nervous system. That's the spinal cord in the brain. And here it gets a little tricky. High histamine in the body causes inflammation, which is usually annoying and sometimes painful. Tissue swells and itches or hurts. But high histamine in the brain can be deadly. There's nowhere for the swollen brain to expand into. It's encased in a rigid skull. So brain swelling can be fatal. The brain must be protected from high histamine levels. Histamine also regulates the release of neurochemicals in the brain. So even mildly elevated brain histamine that wouldn't cause dangerous swelling can cause mania and other neurologic problems. To protect the brain from the effects of high histamine, there's a special histamine receptor called the H3 receptor in the brain and spinal cord. When it senses high histamine in the blood, it decreases the histamine in the brain as a safety measure. Unfortunately, in some people, the H3 histamine receptor is overreactive. The way receptors are usually supposed to work is that they're in the off position until they're triggered. But sometimes a receptor has a genetic defect, and it's always in an on position. It might only be 20% on rather than full 100%, but it can be a problem. This is called constitutive activity. So what happens when a high histamine blood level triggers the H3 receptors in a person? Histamine regulates the release of neurotransmitters, including acetylcholine, dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, and GABA. High blood histamine causes low brain histamine, and the general symptoms include headaches, brain fog, difficulty waking up in the morning, difficulty regulating body temperature, vertigo, nausea. Specific to the neurotransmitters, low acetylcholine makes it hard to learn and remember. Low dopamine decreases motivation and in the extreme can lead to Parkinson's disease. Low serotonin can lead to depression. Low norepinephrine leads to difficulty focusing and ADHD. And low GABA makes it hard for people to relax or get deep sleep. What I'm describing is how a person can have what we could say is an allergic brain. Moving on. We have the H4 receptors in our immune system. Let's talk about the 2 immune cells with H4 receptors, namely mast cells and macrophages. Mast cells are the main producers of histamine in the body. They're a very ancient part of our immune system. They predate antibodies, and they trigger our white blood cells to attack infections like bacteria, viruses, fungi, and specifically parasites. Now, parasitic worms are too large to be engulfed and eaten or killed by white blood cells. So the strategy goes like this. When mast cells think they see a parasite, they release histamine, and it triggers one of several reactions. On the skin, it creates itching, which is there to get us to scratch off a parasite. In the gut, it can create diarrhea so that we can defecate the parasites out. In the lungs, histamine creates coughing, so we cough a parasite out. In the sinuses, it creates sneezing, so we sneeze the parasites out. In the eyes, histamine will create tearing and itching, so we wash the parasites out with tears and rub them out. It's a great strategy, but it can also backfire on us. High histamine and mast cell activation can trick the body into thinking we have a parasitic infection when we don't, and that's where we can get allergic reactions. The skin, lung, sinus, and gut reactions that accompanies many allergies is the body thinking that a harmless antigen is a parasite it needs to remove. Macrophage white blood cells also have H4 receptors, which, when activated, cause cholesterol to accumulate in themselves and in nearby tissues. When this process happens in the liver, it's called fatty liver disease. When it happens in the arteries, it's called atherosclerosis. What this means is that atherosclerosis and fatty liver have allergic components to them. We need to broaden our understanding of histamine and allergies. Allergies don't just cause itchy skin, a stuffy nose, or give us foods we can't eat. High histamine can affect any tissue in the body and is a fundamental player in chronic diseases. So what can we do? Should we avoid foods high in histamine? Sure, that's a good place to start. But then there are foods that aren't high in histamine themselves, but trigger the release of histamine from mast cells. Compounds that cause our body to release histamine are made by plants and are one of the ways plants deter animals from eating them. One class of these histamine-releasing agents are called lectins. If you're allergic to nightshades or peanuts or some other foods, it's likely the lectins causing this reaction. It's not just foods, however. Airborne allergens like mold can also trigger mast cells. So can chronic infections. And even exposure to electromagnetic fields. Yes, some people are literally allergic to electromagnetic waves. EMF sensitivity is actually worse than a food sensitivity because you could choose to limit your diet, but limiting EMF is nearly impossible in modern society. Another issue is that once mast cells get activated, they can persist for a long time. When histamine activates H4 receptors on mast cells, they can infiltrate into the local tissue. Mast cells in the tissue then make more histamine, causing more mast cells to infiltrate in a self-reinforcing cycle, causing tissue to become more and more allergic and reactive as time goes on. Injuries can also trigger mast cells to enter tissue. This includes concussions and whiplash. Mast cells are part of the initial healing process, such as pulling wound edges closer together. But if a person's healing process gets derailed, then the mast cells can enter the injured tissue and just keep accumulating. We know what a physical scar is. What I'm describing is an immunologic scar. Basically, it's post-traumatic stress disorder at a tissue level. Injured tissue can become allergic tissue if the mast cells don't leave. In order to get the tissue to stop this allergic and inflammatory cycle, we need to get the mast cells to leave. But to do that, we need to first stop triggering the H4 receptors. We need to lower excessive histamine. So what are our options? What about taking antihistamine drugs? Well, the issue is threefold. While there are well-tolerated antihistamines for the H1 and H2 receptors, that's the skin, gut, lungs, the antihistamines for H3 and H4 can have a lot of side effects and require a specialist to oversee. 2. While antihistamine drugs can be very effective at resolving symptoms, they do not address the underlying cause of the dysfunction, and over a period of as little as 1 to 3 weeks, a person can develop tolerance to the drugs, so the dosage may need to keep increasing. 3. Even regular antihistamines have been shown to cause side effects. Studies have shown an increase in cancer and infertility over time with antihistamines. So what can we do? First, what is a person allergic to? If it is a food, avoiding the offending food will help. An elimination diet can help figure this out. And there's also blood tests you can do at home that are very useful. If you go the testing route, you want both allergy and intolerance tests. Okay, let's look at a case study. I mentioned I was researching this to help a friend, but in her case, it wasn't food she was allergic to. Here are the clues I had to work with. She got worse during smoke season. She got worse when she cooked food. She got worse during wet weather. And she got 30% better by improving her microbiome. What do these have in common? Well, 3 of them are airborne. And in terms of the microbiome, I'll get back to that in a minute. Okay, it was an airborne allergy, but what's in the air that a person can react to? Well, there's mold. 70% of homes have mold in them. There's dust mites. 80% of homes have dust mites. Why was she reacting to cooking food? Well, she cooked over a propane stove. And mercaptan is a chemical added to propane, so it gives it that garlicky smell. That way, if there's a propane leak, you'll be able to tell because propane itself has no odor. When propane burns, the mercaptan burns with it, and it creates sulfur dioxide, and sulfur dioxide is something that can stimulate mast cells. You can also be allergic to pollen. Over 1/4 of the U.S. population is diagnosed with the pollen allergy every year. And then you've got regular pollution, air pollutants like VOCs, particulates, nitrogen oxides. These can all trigger histamine release. A number of these come from vehicle exhausts, especially diesel. So if you live in a city or by a major road, you're getting this kind of pollution. So what can we do for this woman? Well, she cooked with propane, so a vented hood was put over her stove to remove any of the combusted mercaptan. For pollen, dust mites, and mold, HEPA filters were added to every room in the house. And these changes helped, but not enough. Going deeper, I found that in addition to avoiding allergic foods and improving air quality, there are 4 more things we needed to do for people with histamine problems. First, we need to reprogram the immune system so people stop reacting to airborne allergies. But some immune reaction will still take place, so then we need to suppress the biochemical creation of histamine from the dietary amino acid histidine. But some histamine will still be created. So 3, we want to stabilize the mast cells and basophils so they don't release their histamine excessively. But some histamine may still be excessively released, so that 4, we want to break down any excessive histamine in the bloodstream before it reaches and activates the histamine receptors. To do this, I made her a mix with the following ingredients. Rosmarinic acid to reprogram the immune system by clearing out the hyperreactive T cells. Green tea extract to block the histamine production by suppressing the enzyme histamine decarboxylase, which turns histidine into histamine. Quercetin, which stabilizes histamine-containing cells like mast cells. And then finally, diamine oxidase, or DAO. DAO is the enzyme the body makes to break down extracellular histamine and other toxic amines. The challenge was that quercetin and DAO are not well absorbed. They work wonderfully in the gut, and if all you're dealing with is gut allergies, that's fine. But if the allergy is in the bloodstream now, you need something that can get into the bloodstream. So to do this, we took the quercetin and the DAO and made them into a liposomal for her. So what was the result? Well, rather than sleeping until 10 a.m., 1 spoonful of the mix at 7 in the morning, and a few minutes later she will wake up and her mood is greatly improved. It was pretty quick. Of course, the reprogramming of her immune system will take more time, but it was a major win for her. And when I saw how helpful this was for her, and I understood how many people likely had something similar going on, I knew I had to make it available to other people, so I did, and I called the product Testament. Now, I said earlier that initially she got 30% better by repairing her microbiome. Why was that? When the microbiome is out of whack, a person can start making putrescine and cadaverine. These are toxic amines that when they enter the bloodstream, they cause any DAO present to become much less effective at breaking down histamine. So the same DAO enzyme that breaks down histamine will also break down putrescine and cadaverine, but it gets degraded in the process of doing that. So part of any histamine detox has to include supporting the microbiome, and you can consider our Panaceum product for this. So if you think you have a histamine toxicity issue, what's a protocol you can consider? First, you can consider our Testament histamine detox product. It contains the rosmarinic acid, the green tea extract in a decaffeinated form because caffeine will activate histamine as well, quercetin and DAO enzymes all in a liposomal form. Secondly, you could consider our metacardium EDTA. It's a magnesium-based EDTA. And why might you want to do this? Well, many histamine issues are caused or worsened by metal toxicity, so EDTA may be helpful here. And secondly, a magnesium deficiency can increase the histidine decarboxylate 30 times. So if someone is low in magnesium, they can end up with grossly elevated levels of histamine. Third, you can consider detoxifying yourself from chemicals. Toxic chemicals can also activate mast cells to release histamine. And for that, you can consider our Zetaplex product. Additionally, you may want to consider the following. Decreased dietary histamine. Refrigerators are a wonderful invention, but now we end up eating a lot of leftovers, and leftovers have histamine. Limit your fish consumption. The bacteria in the gills of the fish will colonize the fish to create histamine relatively quickly, so unless you caught the fish yourself and cooked it up right there by the ocean or the river or lakeside, there's likely to be histamine in there. Avoid canned or fermented foods, and then limit avocados and citrus. Go online and get a list of the high histamine foods and the histamine releasing foods, and consider taking a break from those for a few weeks and see how you feel. Also, you're going to want to limit alcohol consumption. Alcohol is metabolized by the enzyme alcohol dehydrogenase, and that enzyme is required to make the enzyme diamine oxidase, which is what breaks down histamine. So the more alcohol a person has to break down, the less able they are to break down histamine. If you think most of your histamine issues are coming from food, you could consider sprouting peas, lentils, or chickpeas in the dark. That will provide an enormous amount of DAO, and then you can just eat that, just don't cook it. But if your histamine reaction is from something airborne, that's not going to help. For airborne histamine triggers, add good air filtration to where you live and work. And while you're detoxifying histamine, you might want to consider avoiding temperature extremes, especially cold weather, physical vibration, and sunburns. Yes, some people become allergic to ultraviolet. Okay, so this has been a lot of information. So let me give you the view from 30,000 feet on how this process occurs and how we develop allergies. Some of us have genetic mutations such as low DAO production or poor methylation because there is another enzyme that breaks down histamine intracellularly that requires methylation. Some of us have constitutive activity, which means the histamine receptors are overly active, even in a theoretically off state. And all of these can trigger allergies. Vaccine adjuvants, the compounds added to vaccines to, in some cases, stabilize them, but also in order to make them more effective by triggering the immune system, well, they are basically creating allergies to the antigen in the vaccine, but they can also cause allergens to other things that might have been in the vaccine, squalene or maybe egg proteins, and increasing general allergic response is something that vaccine adjuvants are known to do. There's over 50, and I've heard some people say 80 vaccinations that we're now expected to get on the schedule before 18, with more every year. Aluminum specifically is known to trigger mast cells, and that is found in a lot of vaccine adjuvants. A poor microbiome is less able to help the immune system differentiate between active infections requiring response and harmless antigens that should be ignored. Pesticide, fungicide, herbicide, aflatoxins, preservatives, and other chemical residues in foods can trigger food allergies. Physical trauma and an improperly healed injury can create allergic tissue. And excessive EMF exposure can create allergies. There's actually quite a bit of science about what goes on with the calcium channels, which we don't have time to go in here. But when I say that a person can become allergic to EMF, there's a very strong scientific basis for exactly how that happens. Consider the number of people who spend hours with their cell phones against their ears or in a breast pocket or in their pants, and what they may be doing in terms of creating allergic tissue there. Metal toxicities can trigger allergies. We live in a world that's continuously pushing us into allergic states. Detoxifying ourselves and balancing excessive histamine and mast cell activity is part of the general maintenance we need to do if we want to experience optimal health. Okay, now that I've completed the main body of this video, I'm going to answer some questions that haven't been addressed yet. How is it that some people become allergic to their medications? Okay. Many medications, including over-the-counter meds, suppress diamine oxidase, thus raising histamine levels. But mast cells are very intelligent in their own way. Anything that they consider a threat, they can cause a reaction to. So a person can become allergic to many things. And pharmaceutical drugs are in those classes of things a person can become allergic to. Is histamine associated with Lyme disease? Yes. Histamine is a peculiar infection. The immune system can kill it easily if it can catch it. As a result, Lyme has 3 strategies. First, cloak itself so the immune system doesn't see it. Secondly, it has a very fast propulsion system. It's got a twin turbine engine, and it can go 500 times faster than our own white blood cells. And then 3, it makes a beeline while cloaked at high speed straight into tissue where we don't want to fight it. This tissue is called immune-privileged tissue. This is tissue where the immune system should not fight an infection because the inflammation of the immune reaction can cause too much damage. So consider the skin. It has a lot of area to expand into, and it regenerates very quickly. So a person's immune system has no reason not to mount a very strong and vigorous response in the skin. Now, consider the joints or the brain. These are tissues that don't regenerate quickly and are enclosed in a rigid structure. There's not a lot of room for the swelling to go. So these are called immune-privileged tissues. They're places where the body will not mount a traditional immune response. What happens instead is the body tries to put infections in these immune-privileged tissues to sleep. It's a win. The infection stays there, but it's dormant until the person dies or becomes so old that they can no longer keep it in check. So that is what's supposed to happen. But in some people, their body is not good at putting these infections to sleep, and then the Lyme disease becomes active in immune-privileged tissue. And so Lyme disease, which we know causes major problems in the heart and the joints and the brain, may be doing this to a large extent through histamine release. Is histamine associated with long COVID? Yes. Mast cells can be activated by spike proteins, and activated mast cells release histamine. The heart has all 4 histamine receptors. So chronic spike protein production can definitely trigger heart issues in all 4 of its receptors. How do allergies cause atherosclerosis? Okay, that's a deep question. Foam cells, which are the cells that the plaque is made of, basically these are macrophages that have gotten so much cholesterol and swollen up so much they've died. Well, macrophages, they express histamine decarboxylase. that is the enzyme that turns histidine into histamine. Also, H4 receptors trigger cholesterol to enter both the macrophages and the tissue. So atherosclerosis is intimately related to histamine, and I would say it's reasonable to say that atherosclerosis is primarily an allergic phenomena. Are allergy tests necessary? Okay. While there are some inflammatory chemicals that are immediately released when we're exposed to allergens, such as histamine, tumor necrosis factor, tryptase, and heparin, and then there's a few chemicals released a few minutes after exposure, like prostaglandins and leukotrienes, some allergic reactions take place hours after exposure, like the release of cytokines and inflammatory interleukins. Because of this delay, you might never connect your exposure to the allergen that you ate with the symptom that you're getting. So if it's possible, get a food allergy intolerance. So if possible, get both food and airborne allergy and intolerance tests to help you identify your allergens. How long does histamine last in the body? Well, when you look up the half-life of histamine, you get answers ranging from several minutes to several hours. How can this be? Well, what this is telling us is that people have a very wide range of DAO production. In healthy people, DAO breaks down histamine very quickly, a few minutes at most. And in chronically ill people, they're not making enough DAO, and the histamine doesn't get broken down and lingers in their body, causing problems for hours. Why do I recommend taking bitters with Testament? Mast cells have the TAS2R bitter receptor on their surface. They, in essence, can taste the bitter flavor. And when activated, the bitter receptors do a few things. First, they stabilize the mast cells so they stop producing histamine and other inflammatory chemicals. Secondly, they may suppress the infiltration of mast cells into the inflamed tissue. What's amazing is that when mast cells are activated by an allergen or an antigen, these bitter receptors increase in numbers. This is because the body knows that chronic mast cell activation and tissue infiltration are damaging. The increase in bitter receptors happens so that when it's time to turn the mast cell off and stop migration into the tissue and stop producing histamine, it can happen very quickly. Activated mast cells are primed to turn off if they get the right signal. That means we can use bitters to help suppress mast cell tissue infiltration and activation. I didn't put bitters into the Testament product because that would mean that pregnant women would not be able to use it. However, if you're not pregnant and you're going to use Testament, consider using our bitter product Zoibin along with it. If you have any questions, feel free to call us. Take care.